We can provide paper printouts of photographs for a very inexpensive rate, 50 cents each. If teachers want actual photographic reproductions, we do have to follow our fee schedule. Unfortunately, we can't do that for nothing. The custom scans are about $15 each. If it's already been scanned, it's in the system and we can just print it on our MFD machine, we're happy to do that so the teachers can take that into the classroom. We are probably working on kits again. We used to have kits back in the 1980s that teachers could sign out that had sort of like this, a copy of the map, copies of photographs, copies of documents, and then some suggestions for working them into the lesson plan. So I think certainly going to a digital version of those kits is something we want to work on in the not so distant future. And our museum here also has programs available for teachers to bring their kids in, do a museum program during which they're exposed to some archival records. And then that can be a springboard then for further exploration. At the secondary school level, we've worked with teachers in smaller groups of students who come in and they're doing individual projects. Most archives are really happy to do that, provided that you give them a heads up and lots of lead time, and that as the teacher you provide some clear sort of direction in terms of the outcome that you want. You want your students working with original letters or documents or maps, and what do you hope that they'll get out of it? Just coming in and saying, I want to look at everything that's connected to the history of my community is a little daunting, and for both the archivist and the student as well. I suggest that those teachers contact their local museums, actually. Museums almost always know where the archives are. They might be connected to a historical society, they might be connected to a library, or they might be connected to the museum. And they're often run on a small budget with 1 or 2 staff, so giving that heads up is often important. You might need to make an appointment to go in and talk to the archivist, and then explain what you're hoping to achieve, the sort of age level of your students, what you're studying, what part of the curriculum you're hoping to tie this into, and then let them tell you what they've got and how they can share that with you. So often when we're explaining what archives are, we do compare it a little bit to a library. Libraries have wonderful resources, especially for local history. What's different between archives and a library is, for example, this book, which has a Peel subject, the Reverend Peter Jones. But this book you may find in a number of libraries across Peel, across the province, across Canada. When we go into our storage area and you see some of our original records generated by the Mississauga First Nation, they only exist here. They aren't copied, they aren't disseminated. You can't go to any other archives to find them. So generally speaking, the difference between a library and an archives is that the archival material is unique. It's only found in one place. That's why we don't have it out for people to just browse. That's why it's in a secured storage area. That's why archivists work closely to safeguard it and provide it with conditions for longevity, because it is irreplaceable. This is the reading room of the Region of Peel Archives, and most archives do have a reading room of a similar type. It's the place where you come to interact with the records. You meet the staff, talk about your needs, and they try to match up what you're looking for with the records that they have in their care. There's usually space to work. In our case here, we have a few records left out from this morning. We have workstations around, including some microfilm reader scanners, so we're able to look at things like newspapers on microfilm. And in our case, you can bring your own USB key and make free copies to take home with you. We have a public access computer as well for working with things like Ancestry if you're doing genealogy. On the wall behind us, we have a number of finding aids, and a finding aid is something we create. It's a little bit like the library where you have the catalog and you can look up information about a book as well as going and getting the book itself. In this case, our finding aids give lots of background information about records, and this is where the archivist on duty would say you should probably, if you're interested in this case for records from Caledon, you might want to look at the McEnany collection, and you read this, and if that seems to be something you would like to see more of, then we would pull the original records and bring them here to the reading room for you to work with. They were kind of state-of-the-art when we got them. But what's great is you can just scan whatever part you want. You can go quickly, you can go slowly. You can be looking for news, you can be looking for advertising. Some of the advertising is pretty funny. They're talking about radio coming in, and then we just we can move the boundaries and just scan what we like. So it's a really fun way to explore local history, and this is actually a really good source for teachers. Most communities do have newspapers in some format that are available, and so children can look at this day in history, or they can look at a certain event, maybe a national event, the end of the war. How was that expressed locally? What did their community do to celebrate or commemorate that event? Okay, terrific. So some of our records are a little too big to fit in a box, so those records are stored in map drawers, and I've got a couple here that are typical probably of most small towns. In this case, this provides some interesting evidence. Brampton used to be known as Buffy's Corner, and people talk about that because William Buffy was apparently an innkeeper. But here the archival record shows that William Buffy was actually the township clerk for the township of Chinguacousy. That's the large area that surrounded Brampton. This is a very old document. It's dated 1848, and it's a public notice. You'll notice when you look at the bylaws too, they're all printed in this kind of large poster format. The reason for that was that there was no internet. People didn't even have newspapers really at this time. You found out what the bylaws were and the rules by reading these posters in the general store or the post office. They're called broadsides, and we have quite an interesting collection. This one I think is interesting. It's talking about obtaining shop and tavern licenses. So it's talking about taxation even as early as 1869, so a couple of years after Confederation. Brampton is on its way to growing. Now obviously fragile archival originals are probably not going to be shared with students in a large setting, but we can bring a small group of students into the archives and show them specific things. This is an old land grant document. It's actually printed on parchment. It's not paper. It's very, very finely tanned leather. And at the bottom you have the Great Seal of the province of Upper Canada. And when it was new, that seal was bright, bright scarlet red. The ink, the dye on the paper has faded, and all that's left is a little bit of pink in the ribbon. What the document itself is all about is the transfer of land title from the Crown to the first settler on that piece of property. And to receive this, they would have to clear the land, build a log cabin, fence the road allowance in front of their property, and a lot of really arduous work. This document was then proof that they had completed that work. They could then turn around and sell their property. So it's really the start of land development, although most of the people who got these Crown grants really stayed and farmed their property, and they didn't sell it for a couple of hundred years. What I love about archives is the fact that in many cases the records survive, and of course people die. People move on, or they leave the country perhaps, they go back to England, and sometimes all that's left to tell their entire story is an archival record. And we have two very different records here, but they're from about the same period. This is 1845, I believe, and it's a letter and written to my dear uncle and aunt. And when the writer had finished writing the story, the letter I should say, this is folded up, and you can see here it was turned into an envelope, and there's the address and then all the cancellation marks, and this would have been mailed. This is called a cross-written letter, and there are many of them. It was very common in the 1840s for letters to be written this way, not to perplex the person at the other end. It's not secret code. It's actually a letter written this way first, line by line, and when the writer got down to this corner, they gave it a quarter turn. Oh, I'm sorry, gave it a quarter turn that way, and kept writing. And then they turned it over, filled this side, and then turned it and continued to write here. The reason for this was to get as much communication onto one piece of paper as was possible. Postage was very expensive in the 1840s, and actually the recipient had to pay to get the letter. You didn't pay to send it. So you tried to be very economical in your writing and get as much of the news as you could onto a single piece of paper. It's not impossible to read these letters. You just have to really concentrate and usually take a ruler and you just try to read it line by line. Some very, very interesting stories contained in these early letters. This is called the Hanna Young letter, and it was written in 1832 by a young woman who had just arrived here in Peel, and she talks about the fact that it took 3 months to get here from England. 3 months. Partially on the ocean and then traveling from Quebec. And she talks about the isolation. She talks about seeing England receding and knowing she would never see it again. She talks about her nearest English neighbor being 12 miles and how happy she was to discover that she had an English neighbor who was only 12 miles away. A couple of things that are very interesting about this letter is actually 2 letters, but the same hand, the same person wrote it. So we know that Hanna wrote a letter from herself, then she wrote a letter from her husband, and we assume that's because he was illiterate and he didn't know how to write. When Hanna had completed her letter, like the previous one we saw, she put the address on it, folded it up, and sent it off to England. And it got there, and it was held by that family for over 100 years. And then in the 1980s, they contacted us and said, would we be interested in having this letter for the archives? And we said, of course we would. And so they brought the letter back. What has happened, it's interesting how documents evolve and change, and before it came to us, someone ripped off the cancellation mark because to them that stamp or cancellation mark had more value than what has value for us would be what were those words. We'll never know what was written there. So it's interesting how people put different values on things. In order to help Hanna's letter survive, we have encapsulated it. So it's sitting quite nicely between 2 pieces of mylar. This is not plastic in that it's not laminated, I should say. It's not contacting. It hasn't been impregnated into the paper fibers, but it makes it strong. We can handle it, we can look at it, and we don't have to worry about damaging it any further. So that's the Hanna Young letter, one of my favorites. If it's not here after I retire, they'll come after me and look for it.